Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Old Buick. Hello there. The new cars are so thick on the streets of the harbor town these days that a car as many as 5 years old begins to take on a museum look. Car owners today begin to think of a car as old if it's not more than 2 years on its speedometer. But time was when the changes in cars came so slowly and the improvements so few that a motorist could drive his horseless carriage for several years before he decided to give it up for a new model. It was before the days of finance companies that made it possible to pay while you drive, and in the time when any kind of car was a treasure for its owner. Which brings us to the story in tonight's scrapbook of the stout-hearted old one-cylinder shade that stood waiting in its stall for a generation, only to find that time and the race had passed it by, and it was a back number. And then, like every dog, it had its day. So when Dick has taken his customary few seconds for a word from our sponsor, we'll unravel the story of the 1904 Buick that went into retirement only to emerge from it 2 decades later to make a proud debut in an Aberdeen show window. And now, Dick, the words from our sponsor. It was back in 1909 that our story gets started. Back in 1909, a homesteader named Jensen, who owned quite a packet of property up on Hood's Canal, was approached by a Puyallup doctor to sell a chunk of his real estate along the salt water. The doctor, with a far-sighted eye, saw some tall possibilities in the tidal beaches of that body of water, and he wanted a chunk of it. And the homesteader wasn't disinterested in the deal, but just couldn't see parting with the good land for a few dollars. It seems that he had been stung in the bank closing in the panic of 1907, and had decided that a man ought to keep his gains in property. So after considerable dickering, the doctor found he was getting nowhere, and then he had an idea. He drove to the homesteader's place to conduct his business session in a 1904 Buick automobile that was now 5 years old. By the way, homesteader Jensen's face lit up when he saw the car rolling down the road towards the webbed hill, convinced the doctor that the car was a better incentive to make the deal than any amount of money. So he offered to trade the farmer the car for the real estate, and apparently it was the David Harmon touch that was needed. For the homesteader jumped at the opportunity, and the deed was transferred a few days later. Jensen took the title to the 1904 Buick and proudly drove it to Shelton to his homestead on the banks of the Skycomish River. But right here, our story takes an unorthodox turn. Instead of becoming the most sporting homesteader in the valley and skylarking around the canal country in his new car, Jensen decided to put it carefully away until there were roads in the back country. You see, he lived upriver a ways, and the only way you could approach his cluster of houses and barn was across a field, up a gravel bar of the Skycomish River when the tide was out. He decided that to get his money's worth out of the car, he'd have to lay it away, like the best suit of clothes, and keep it until the roads were built to his homestead. Then the question of how to lay it away. He finally decided to haul it up the Skycomish River and then tow it up the gravel bar at low tide, behind a team of dapple mares. The scheme worked fine, and when he pulled it to this barn, his young son helped him roll it in, and the slant door was closed on the horseless carriage until the day that the highways would reach Jensen's place. Now, you know about those plans of men. They're really not worth much, and a lot of us have discovered. And homesteader Jensen never saw the coming of the highways. 4 years later, he died, and his horseless carriage sat quietly in the barn while neighbors bore his coffin to the final resting place among the maples of his rich bottomland. His son Arthur was now old enough to manage a plow, and he took over. And with his other duties, he had too much to do to pay attention to the moldering mechanical marvel that was covered with dust and cobwebs in the back of the old barn. One by one, the years dropped away, and when the road came, it stopped a mile below the house. Young Arthur decided that was a better place for a house and a barn anyhow, and about that time, the First World War, he built a new house and outbuildings downstream on the highway, and the old barn and the old house moldering undisturbed. The barn finally collapsed in a big storm one night, and the thick shakes of the still sturdy roof rained down on the patient automobile still standing there, and made an interesting roof over the ancient vehicle. The house collapsed, and the evergreen berry vines grew over the spot where the house and the barn had stood for so many years. They were forgotten. The First World War came and ended with the armistice. Warren G. Harding was elected president and died in office. Grays Harbor residents noted that Billy Gould had finally died at the Medical Lake Hospital, and young Joel Wolfe returned from a trip around the world. Coach Pete Barretto turned out a champion basketball team in Hoquiam, and young Kenneth McCow won the oratory contest at Weatherwax High School. Grays Harbor and the nation were in the throes of prosperity and limited. Then came the summer of 1929. M.M. Stewart, one of the harbor's pioneer automobile dealers, was an agent for the Buick and was aggressively promoting his automobile with every means possible. Several times he had searched for an ancient car bearing the brand that he handled, but none of his discoveries had been sufficiently ancient to warrant getting excited over. And then one day, when he was visiting over in Shelton, he heard of an old car that stood for years in a barn up on the Skycomish. It might still be there, his informant told him. It's been there for years and years. Stewart made some inquiries and finally met Andrew Jensen, the son of the man who had taken the car in trade for a piece of real estate. Yes, Andrew replied. His father did have an old car, and it was in the barn out about a mile back up at the old place. But the barn had fallen down, and he thought the car had disintegrated with time and elements. But he'd look to see. Well, a few weeks later, Sargent thought he'd press the matter a little, so he jumped in his car and drove to Jensen's place on the Skycomish and found Andrew at home. Together they walked out through the fields, following the winding trail and seldom used trails to the old barn. A pile of cedar shakes was visible through the blackberry vines, and with a brush hook, Jensen cut out a way of the tangled growth that had covered the spot where the barn had once stood. Then one by one the two men removed the moss-covered shakes, still sound and turning the water, and there, underneath a layer of dust, shakes, leaves, and vines, there stood an ancient vehicle, just as it had been driven in by its owner 20 years before. Oh, the leather top straps were mildewed. Quail had made a nest in the front seat. The brass radiator and hubcaps were dull, and the woodwork was pretty well gone. But the trail had been cleared through the growth of a generation, and the two men easily rolled the ancient vehicle through the field and back to Jensen's house. Stewart carted the old car to his Aberdeen shop on the bed of a GMC truck, and the crew of the mechanics and sales shop gathered round to see how they used to make them. With polish and elbow grease, the crew cleaned up the brass hubcaps, the handmade radiator cap and the brass radiator. They oiled the old leather to a new softness and replaced some of the wooden members of the body that had long since given up. The angle iron frame was still solid, and the big brass coil oil burning headlamps were still in good as new. And what was more important, the two-cylinder motor, the 2 cylinders opposed was almost as good as the day that they had turned out for the first valve in a head motor ever built in America. Its 2-gear transmission still worked, and the chain drive purred when it put the car into gear, blocked up in the shop. For weeks, the crew put in their spare hours on the ancient car, meanwhile trying to learn something of its pedigree. Through its manufacturer, they found that it was one of 100 cars of its kind manufactured in the year 1904. And in 1929, it came out of retirement. Only 2 others remained in their original form. The rest were gone, junked, or converted to something else. The old car had a great day. On June 4th, the Husky shop cranked the side crank on the ancient machine, and the 2-cylinder motor began to snort and roll. Then, with its owner at the helm of the steering bar, and with the chain clanking over the sprocket, it did a turn down Market Street and back and went into the display room of the Stewart Company for all Grays Harbor to see. It was surrounded by the new cars of 1929, themselves nearly as old today as the 1904 was when it came out of retirement. But among all the cars displayed, it was the star. It was the old Sidewinder that the people of Grays Harbor flocked to see, to remind each other of the days when Frank Becker's Oldsmobile had gotten stuck in gear at the corner of Heron and F Street and had to run in circles until it ran out of gas. Or the days when Ed Dolan had raced his new horseless carriage down the main street of town wide open for a purse said to be $1,000. The old car had a place of honor in the 4th of July parade in 1929, and its story was told in the publications of the Northwest as it finally had its great day. And now, Dick, a few words from our sponsor. It was the year 1926 when the highway finally came to Andrew Jensen's place on the Skycomish River. 17 years later, Jensen's father put the 1904 Buick into its stall in the barn to wait for the coming of the road. And those 17 years wrote the story of the automobile, for in that span of time the vehicle propelled by the internal combustion engine that it was going to push old Dobbin right out of his place in the sun, and the horseless carriage of the early years became the durable, drivable car of the late 20s, with electric lights and self-starters, and really not so much different from the cars of today. And the manufacturer of Buicks pointed with pride to the durability of the ancient 2-cylinder buggy that had defied time and the elements to make a comeback and enjoy its day in the sun, and incidentally provide us with tonight's chapter in our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.